I want to support the Labour Party amendment, but also Amendment 31 in the name of two Sinn Féin TDs as well. A number of these amendments are grouped. Minister, we had very lengthy discussions on second stage where we set out our overall view of the bill and the government's failure in this area. And at the heart of that failure is what is being addressed in amendments which have been tabled by various different opposition groupings. And the reason why there is unity from amongst the opposition on this is because it makes sense. It is simply common sense that we would put in place mandatory hotel quarantine for all non-essential travel, irrespective of where somebody is coming from. For the vast majority of people out there, that makes sense. Opinion polls show it is supported by over 90% of the people in this state. It seems everybody accepts that this is a good idea, except the Cabinet, the Government and you as Minister for Health. 9 months ago, NEFID argued with the Government and recommended that you remove all discretionary elements of the travel checks. And your Government refused to listen to them. Members of the opposition were on numerous TV programmes and radio programmes where we argued with you and your colleagues in government and your backbench TDs in relation to the disastrous policy of the government on checks and controls at airports. And every time it was raised in this House by Dáil deputies in opposition, it was knocked back by the Taoiseach, by the Taoiseach, by the Minister for Transport, by yourself and by others, that it simply wasn't necessary and it simply wasn't possible. And here we are 9 months later, and all of a sudden hotel mandatory quarantine is possible, but it's only possible for people coming from some countries and not people coming from all countries. So while this is a half measure, and a half measure you could argue is better than no measure, in reality that's not the case because of the new variants and new strains of this virus, which are highly contagious and highly dangerous, as we know. The refusal of your government to listen to the public health advice 9 months ago and ever since has led us to a situation where you have had to scramble to put in place legislation at the 11th hour, at the last minute. You still have not worked out all of the details of how this is going to work. You still haven't given us any commencement date for when this bill that we are debating here today will come into effect. We are not in a position to give any of that information to the public, and nor are you, because if you were, you would be communicating it to us. And you still haven't given us, and nor has the Taoiseach, and nor has the Taoiseach, and nor did the leader of the Green Party today when he was pressed on this on leaders' questions, have you been able to give us any satisfactory, reasonable answer as to why mandatory quarantine cannot be put in place for all non-essential travellers, irrespective of what country they come from. We have heard from the Taoiseach that one of the reasons may be because Iceland and the Isle of Man and other countries that have very low levels of the variant. Why would you stop people coming from those countries when there's very low levels? Can you imagine what that does to somebody who is, at this point in time, at home, working from home, has been for months, or a person who lost their job and is at their home and staying in their house unless they're going for a grocery shop or food or for some essential service? And the parents of children who have been homeschooled for the last number of months. And the impact of what has happened since the new restrictions were brought into being. And bear in mind, people have been living with some form of restrictions for months. Imagine how that person hears that it's okay for people from Iceland and the Isle of Man to come, get on a plane, come over to Ireland. But those same people cannot leave their own house unless it's for essential purposes, and cannot move outside of their own area, 5 kilometres outside of their own area. But yet travel is still permitted. And the fact the government doesn't get that anger and frustration, and doesn't get the logic of that, or the illogic of their position as people see it, is absolutely infuriating. Minister, what you essentially are saying to members of this House is that you are putting in place a two-tier quarantine system. There will be mandatory hotel quarantine for people coming from some countries, so we'll have some level of protection, and I would imagine the reason for that is to stop the importation of any of the new variants or the virus itself. So we're going to do it for some countries, but for the other countries we're going to continue with the nod and wink home quarantine, which in fact is no quarantine at all. It is quarantine in name only. We did hear yesterday from the General Secretary of the Association of Garda Sergeants and Inspectors. And what she said, Minister, was that there was absolutely no consultation with her organisation in relation to the role that they will play in policing any of this. She said they had been given no operational instructions, and she said they had been given no guidelines. And yet the government are telling us that this will be enforced, that this can work, and yet the very organisation that will be tasked with enforcing it have not been consulted with and have not been given any instructions. How, in God's name, is anybody meant to have confidence in that process? And it is beyond breathtaking that the government are still continuing with that nonsense. This simply cannot be enforced, Minister. Home quarantine will not be enforced, cannot be enforced. And I, like Deputy Kelly, am putting you on notice, and I think it's important for the opposition to put your government on notice, that if it's the case that you don't go the full distance, which is what you should do, you should be accepting these amendments today, going the full distance and making sure that we have the most robust quarantine and testing regime in place for international travel. If you don't do it, then if new variants of the virus come from any of those countries, that's on you and your government. You will have to take full responsibility for it. The failure to act is solely yours. It does not belong to NEFID. It will not belong to anybody else in opposition. It will not belong to the Irish people, who are doing their absolute best. They are at their wits' end, as has been accepted by the Taoiseach in the speech that he gave a few days ago. People are frustrated, people are fed up. Of course they are. They're fed up with the restrictions, but they're also fed up with the government's half measures. They're also fed up with the fact that it's one rule for them: don't leave your own home or 5 kilometres outside of your own home. But people can come in on planes from most countries in the world and are not subject to any quarantine. It is driving people spare. It is driving people bonkers, and rightly so. And that anger and frustration, in my view, will continue to grow. But it will reach a very, very high level if, over the next number of weeks and months, we see continued importation of any strain of this virus into the state, when people are doing their absolute best to keep the numbers low. We had several conversations in this chamber, Minister, about the impact of COVID-19 on frontline hospitals. When the virus gets out of control, what happens? Our hospitals start to fill up, ICU starts to fill up, and unfortunately more people will die. We've seen record numbers of people die in the months of January and February, and I'm sure you and I and people in this chamber will mourn every single one of those people who passed away. But the only way that we can prevent that from happening in the future is to make sure that the system that should be in place is in place, and that the processes that should be in place are in place, and that the solutions that should be in place are in place. And one of those solutions has to be mandatory hotel quarantine and testing. There still is no legal requirement for a mandatory PCR test when somebody comes into this state. Other people want to speak, so I'm going to finish on this one to give respect to those who want to come in, and there's a long list of speakers, I would imagine. One of our amendments was ruled out of order, and that's obviously a matter for the Ceann Comhairle, and decisions are made on ruling amendments out of order for all sorts of reasons. And one of the amendments we tabled was that you, Minister, would engage with your colleague in the North in relation to data sharing. And it was ruled out of order on the basis that it would cost, or it would incur a cost on the Exchequer. I mean, this is how laughable all of this is becoming, but it's really serious. And when you're not dealing with these issues, when you're still not dealing with your colleague in the north, we're still not sharing data, we're still not going the full distance on travel, and we're still not getting all the other elements of it right, why are you surprised that people are angry and frustrated? And there's no point to government then putting it back on the opposition and claiming, as they have done, that some parties or maybe the opposition are playing politics. The only people playing politics, as far as I can see, are the government ministers, who are trying to pin the blame on everybody else but themselves. So you really need, Minister, to step up to the plate on this issue. I would appeal to you, even at this 11th hour, to support these amendments. Because if you do not, and if there's continued importation of this virus into this state as a consequence of your half-baked solutions here today, be that on you and your government and not on the Irish public, who are abiding by the regulations, and not on the opposition, who are pleading with you to do what is right. It will be the sole responsibility of you and your government.